I am continuing in my reading. What I'm doing in this series is to read through the entire standard works of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. This consists of the Bible, the Book of Mormon, the Doctrine and Covenants, and the Pearl of Great Price. I am continuing reading in a chronological order, according to event, not according to publication or volume. So I'm skipping around a bit as I move along. So now we continue in the Gospels again. We are in the last week, the Holy Week, last week of Christ's mortal life. We had the Last Supper, we had the Garden of Gethsemane and his arrest, and we read about his trial before the high priest Caiaphas. Now in our last reading in John, we read about this trial, but also about Peter's denial of Christ. Didn't talk about it too much there, because now we are going to read this again in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. In this video, we have a Joseph Smith translation. Now what the Joseph Smith translation is, this is a translation or correction done by Joseph Smith to restore those passages that have been lost or corrupted over the years. So, Matthew, chapter 26, verses 69 to 75. Now Peter sat without in the palace, and a damsel came unto him, saying, Thou also wast with Jesus of Galilee. But he denied before them all, saying, I know not what thou sayest. And when he was gone out into the porch, another maid saw him, and said unto them that were there, This fellow was also with Jesus of Nazareth. And again he denied with an oath, I do not know the man. And after a while came unto him they that stood by, and said to Peter, Surely thou art also one of them, for thy speech betrayeth thee. Then began he to curse and to swear, saying, I know not the man. And immediately the cock crew. And Peter remembered the words of Jesus, which said unto him, Before the cock crow, thou shalt deny me thrice. And he went out and wept bitterly. What was Peter denying? Did Peter deny that Jesus was the Christ, the Son of God? No. He denied being one of the 12 apostles. He denied knowing Christ personally. That was his denial. He did not deny his faith. Why did he deny? Seems to me that Christ had told the apostles not to interfere. He said, don't, and he had asked the guards, remember in John it says he asked the guards, let these go. I will come with you because that is necessary, but let my apostles go. This was all very confusing to the apostles, and most of them scattered. Peter is the only one that seems to have followed Christ. He wants to be there with him. I think that Peter was waiting for Christ to call on him, to bring him up, say, come help me. But at the same time, Christ had told Peter not to interfere. Remember, Peter was the one who drew the sword and was willing to fight to the death for Christ. Why would he now just deny him? The only reason that I can see, the only reason that makes sense, is that Christ told him not to interfere, and he thinks if I confess, if I reveal who I am, then it might interfere with what Christ is doing. And Christ told me not to be a part of this. So he's staying in the background. He's staying with the servants. He's not even up there with the leaders. He's staying in the background, but he's watching. And when they come, aren't you one of those 12? He goes, no. And again, they come to, we know you're from Galilee. Your accent is a Galilean accent. And he says, I don't know Christ, though. But after the cock crows, and he has denied him thrice, and he remembers what Christ said, I think what sinks in Peter is that Christ is going to die. This is when Peter finally accepts that Christ is going to die. Up to this point, he always thought that this was kind of metaphorical, that it wasn't really going to happen. But now he realizes, my Lord is going to his death. And he goes out and he weeps bitterly. Let us look at the Joseph Smith translation for Matthew here. In verse 70, instead of before them all, it is before all the people. In verse 71, we remove the word maid, so it's just another saw him, and instead of fellow, it is man. In verse 72, again he denied with an oath, saying is added in. In verse 73, we remove unto him, so it's, and after a while came they and stood by, and said to Peter. And instead of, well, I think I misread that. Instead of thy speech bewrayeth thee, it is betrayeth thee. I think I read betrayeth, so it makes much more sense. In verse 75, word is pluralized to words. So Peter remembered the words of Jesus, which he said unto him. Not much there. Nice and simple. Let us continue to Mark. Chapter 14, verses 66 to 72. Now, before we read this, remember that in Mark, the prophecy of Christ was that before the cock crowed twice, you will deny me 3 times. That's what Mark wrote. So let us read this. 14, verses 66 to 72. And as Peter was beneath in the palace, there cometh one of the maids of the high priest, and when she saw Peter warming himself, she looked upon him, and said, And thou also wast with Jesus of Nazareth. But he denied, saying, I know not, neither understand I what thou sayest. And he went out into the porch, and the cock crew. And a maid saw him again, and began to say to them that stood by, This is one of them. And he denied it again, and a little after, they that stood by said again to Peter, Surely thou art one of them, for thou art a Galilean, and thy speech agreeth thereto. But he began to curse and to swear, saying, I know not this man of whom ye speak. And the second time the cock crew, and Peter called to mind the word that Jesus said unto him, Before the cock crow twice, thou shalt deny me thrice. And when he thought thereon, he wept. Now this is almost exactly what we read in Matthew. In with the servants, warming himself. They identify him once, he says, I don't know what you're talking about. Then he goes out onto the porch. They identify him again, he says, Got no, that wasn't me. And then they identify him the third time by his accent. He is a Galilean because he speaks like a Galilean. But he says again, I don't know the man. And then we have the cock. But this time again, we have the cock crows twice. That's the only difference between Matthew and Mark. Everything else is the same. And now let us look at the Joseph Smith translation for Mark. In 66, instead of cometh, it is came. In 67, instead of and thou also wast with Jesus, is now thou also wast with Jesus. Take out the and. In 68, saith is said. In 69, them that stood by is them who stood by. In verse 70, instead of they that stood by is they who stood by, and then we remove and. So thou art a Galilean, thy speech agreeth thereto. And then finally in 72, let's read this. And the second time the cock crew, and Peter called to mind the words which Jesus said unto him, Before the cock crow twice, thou shalt deny me thrice. And he went out and fell upon his face and wept bitterly. Now that's more along the lines of what is recorded in Matthew, so it's just kind of making it say the same thing as Matthew. Nothing new there though. So let us now look at Luke. Luke chapter 22, verses 54 to 62. Then they took him and led him and brought him into the high priest's house, and Peter followed far off. And when they had kindled a fire in the midst of the hall, and were set down together, Peter sat down among them. But a certain maid beheld him as he sat by the fire, and earnestly looked upon him, and said, This man was also with him. And he denied him, saying, Woman, I know him not. And after a little while another saw him, and said, Thou art also of them. And Peter said, Man, I am not. And about the space of 1 hour after, another confidently affirmed, saying, Of a truth, this fellow was also with him, for he is a Galilean. And Peter said, Man, I am not what thou sayest. And immediately, while he yet spake, the cock crew. And the Lord turned and looked upon Peter. And Peter remembered the word of the Lord, how he had said unto him, Before the cock crow, thou shalt deny me thrice. And Peter went out and wept bitterly. Now I want to just mention one thing here. When we read about the trial before the priests in Luke, we read 63 to 71, the last part of this chapter. In Matthew and Mark, the narrative tells first the trial, then Peter's denial. In Luke, it is Peter's denial, and then the trial. John tells us that it is kind of an amalgamation. It's Peter denies once, then we get the trial, then Peter denies 2 more times. Most likely that is how it happened, but the other 3 are simply giving us, here's the trial, this is how Peter denied him. They're not trying to make it perfectly chronological. And that is why now we're getting the account of Peter following the guards when we didn't read that in Luke when we read about the trial. But everything else is basically the same, with that one small note. After Peter denies Christ the 3rd time, Christ looks at him, and Peter looks at Christ. And that is when Peter remembers what Christ prophesied. And as I said, this is when Peter finally realizes that Christ is going to die. And I think that look, that personal look, where they kind of meet eyes, and Christ is silently telling Peter, this is it. Beautiful, really. Now we look at the Joseph Smith translation for Luke. In 55, instead of and were set down, it is and were sat down. And in 59, now we have, in about the space of 1 hour, another confidently affirmed, saying, Of a truth, this man was also with him. minor clarifications, and that is all in Luke. Anyways, we're going to leave that here, and I will see you in the next one.